the paper is one that I wrote together with Maria, based on our research about how Europe reacts to the migration pressure from the outside, migration that's viewed as unwanted generally by Europe, and in many cases unauthorized. That is, people cross Europe's external borders without authorization, some of them to seek asylum and others without that intention. So we were looking at how Europe addresses this problem and tried to make sense of the different policy approaches and what they might mean or how they might be interpreted in different perspectives. So you'll get more of what I mean by that as we proceed. We have copies of the paper printed that you can pick up afterwards. It's a paper that will be published in the British Journal of Politics and International Relations next year. It's a special issue edited by the three people listed there. A special issue called States, Knowledge and Narratives of Migration. It's about migration policy, but it takes a perspective that's in a way more philosophical or theoretical about sort of what do we think we know about migration and how does that inform policy formulation. So in this paper we've combined sort of our work from below and the conceptual framework that the issue editors have approached us with from above and tried to fit them together within this notion of policy narratives, which is central to the whole issue. So the basic question that we ask is, given the inflow of especially both migrants across Europe's external borders, what exactly is Europe doing and what could Europe be doing in confronting that issue? We have structured the paper around 8, I think it is, policy measures, specific things that are done, such as surveillance on the external borders, making sure that everyone who tries to cross is detected and apprehended by the authorities. That's one measure among the 8 that we discuss. But what we do here is to sort of connect the policy measures level with the bigger policy narratives, this idea about linking specific measures with how should I put it in a different term? Presumptions about how the world works, and I'll get back to that. And then at the sort of more detailed level, what we've identified as policy mechanisms, and we have 3 different mechanisms through which the policy measures work. Then we specifically look at this boat migrant flow from West Africa. Maria has done fieldwork in Senegal, in the communities from which many of the boats depart. And we've combined this insight that's gained through fieldwork with the bigger picture of policy development. So what are these policy narratives? This is a term that the journal special issue editors have developed in their introduction to the whole special issue, and which they presented us and said, you know, how does this fit with your thinking? Can you link your empirical research with this way of approaching policy? And we found that, yes, that made a lot of sense. Their starting point is that there's a lot of things we don't know about the world. There are competing claims to knowledge, different versions of what reality looks like. So there's possibly disagreement about the nature of a problem that's addressed through policy, possibly disagreement about the causal mechanisms at work. What exactly is causing undocumented migration at a large scale, for instance? And also there's a disagreement about the effects of policy interventions. And of course these are things we also recognize from the Norwegian policy environment, debates about the effects of measures introduced to reduce the numbers of asylum seekers, for instance. A good or a successful policy narrative depends on both internal and external logic. It must be sort of internally coherent. It must make sense as a story, a link between this is a problem, this is how we're going to address it, and this is what's going to happen after we address it. So consistent and coherent internally, and also plausible in the sense of sounding like a good idea relating to what we think we know about reality. So what we've identified as the sort of relevant narrative frames or policy narratives in this context, in looking at unauthorized migration from Africa in particular, is the narrative of security, the narrative of cooperation, and the narrative of protection. And the last point there refers to protection of migrants themselves. Whereas in the security narrative, there's an element of protection of Europe. So now I'm going to say a bit more about each of those three, explaining how we see them as sort of guiding policy development or informing policy development in this area. So first, we have the security narrative, which is founded on the idea that unauthorized migration represents a security threat to Europe. This has obviously been strengthened since 9/11, and also even more after terrorism incidents in Europe that have been linked to migration in general. And although the link to undocumented or unauthorized migration might not be so explicit, there's a sense that the people we don't even know who are probably the most dangerous in a way. So there is security concerns that are specifically linked with unauthorized migration. Cooperation is, just let me see if this is, yeah. Okay, so a brief introduction to each one first. Cooperation is about the need to manage migration in partnership with countries of origin and transit. That's, as those of you who work in the policy field know, one of the most significant developments in European migration policy over the past decade, this increased emphasis on migration as one aspect in cooperation with third countries. So the idea that Europe can't solve migration issues on our own, we have to do it in collaboration with Libya, Morocco, Senegal, and so on, is really a prominent idea in policy development. And then the protection narrative that unauthorized migrants are vulnerable people that are exposed to great danger and that need protection, and that we must provide that protection. So those three stories, in a way, about the nature of the problem and what needs to be done are what we call these three dominant policy narratives. So to take the first one more in detail, the security narrative is strengthened by the anxiety over states' perceived inability to control migration. So just the fact that undocumented migration from outside Europe has gone on for at least 2 decades, roughly, since the late 1980s, early 1990s, especially after these restrictions were introduced in 1991 by many Southern European countries. This has been an issue, and it's been on the policy agenda throughout these 2 decades, and still it is an issue. So just the feeling that this is something that states are unable to control is a source of anxiety. And also the security narrative is strengthened by the the appeal of firm action in the face of potential danger, meaning that any policy that can be presented as safeguarding European security has some force behind it that can generate funding and political support and so on. Also, all the things we don't know contribute to the anxiety and sense of insecurity, which lead to security-oriented measures. So, for instance, the fact that we don't know who a lot of migrants are, we don't know exactly what their identity is, which country they come from, that in itself is a source of anxiety or insecurity that feeds into the security narrative. And also, anything that has the label security on it is generally more successful at generating funding, political will, and implementation in a complex institutional environment. So getting different European countries to agree on something is a lot more easy if you say it's about security than if you say it's about something that doesn't feel as urgent, to put it very bluntly. The one sort of fact or factor in this that really doesn't go along with this paradigm so well is the image of the vulnerability of migrants. Here we have all these reasons why we should see migration, undocumented migration, as a security threat. And how do we reconcile that with the image of these poor people in small boats? Are they really so dangerous? So there's a sort of challenge to the paradigm in that specific aspect. So a lot of things that give strength to the security paradigm, and then the images of vulnerability, which are very stark visual images, which challenge this way of approaching migration. For the cooperation paradigm, we can also point to things that, or cooperation narrative, we can also point to things that give it force in the policy terrain. First of all, as I said, this has gained prominence as part of a package of relationships with third countries, both in terms of, sort of common ways of approaching third countries altogether, and also with each specific third country, that Europe's relations with Morocco, for instance, is about migration, about the occupation of Western Sahara, about fisheries, about the status of Ceuta and Melilla, and a lot of other issues. And by bringing them all together, Europe has in many cases gained leverage in the migration field by giving concessions in other fields. Perhaps that's most clear with Libya. That was sort of a really an outsider on the international arena, and a lot of the reason why Libya has been taken back into the international community in the way that it has is the necessity of cooperation in the area of migration. And in on the international policy environment, like around the global forums on migration and development, for instance, the idea that migration can be a win-win-win situation for the countries of origin, the countries of destinations, and the migrants themselves is very powerful. So there is this sort of image that at the end of the day, everyone can be happy if we just do things the right way, which also gives force to this narrative. But there are problems, of course. Cooperation with a country like Libya, Senegal, in the field of migration can, to some extent, be presented as cooperation precisely because it's part of a bigger package. Maybe the actions that, for instance, Senegal is taking to facilitate readmission of Senegalese citizens back to Senegal, facilitating surveillance of Senegalese waters, all of that, might very well be something that Senegal is doing, not because those areas are areas of common interest, but because it plays into the overall relationship with Europe and concessions in other fields. So there is something that doesn't feel quite right about the idea that there are common interests when we look at migration alone. Also, European governments have good reason to distrust these countries that we need to cooperate with, Morocco, Senegal, and so on, for two reasons. First of all, their capacity to implement things that we might agree on. For instance, we know that in Morocco, there's been a very clear sort of discourse at the official state level about controlling undocumented migration for a long time. But when it comes to actual implementation on the ground, issues like police corruption and possible police involvement in smuggling and so on is a real challenge to effective implementation. So that's one problem. And the other problem, of course, is the standards of implementation, that if Morocco, for instance, is really efficient at apprehending all the sub-Saharan Africans that try to pass through pass through Morocco, what are they doing to those migrants? Are they treating them in the way that we would like to see? And for instance, we know both with Libya and with Morocco and other transit countries that if they are effective in their implementation, then it might be a problem that they're not adhering to the standards we would like to see. For instance, in ensuring that refugees are not sent back to the country they are fleeing. So these are real challenges to sort of commitment to cooperation with third countries. Then finally there is this narrative of protection, that migrants, unauthorized migrants on small boats, for instance, need our protection. And of course the very powerful images, pictures, footage, and so on feed into that story. And the fact that many, many people lose their lives, we don't know how many, but the fact that we don't know how many also contributes to this idea that there is a serious humanitarian situation that needs our attention. And also, of course, by presenting European actions as protective measures, these actions gain sort of veneer of, or aura of benevolence, that we're doing something good to other people. So they are sort of fuel for the protection narrative. Then what I think, in a way, the main finding, in a way, of our paper is seeing how protection and control often go together. That a lot of measures that can be presented as protecting migrants are at the same time controlling migrants, keeping them in their place. So one very obvious example is the patrolling of African waters that prevents migrants from reaching European coasts and seeking asylum if they wish to do so. That is very often presented as a protective measure to prevent loss of life at sea. At the same time, as we know, it can be very effective control. One of the facts that doesn't go so well with this narrative is actual research findings on human smuggling. Because this narrative of protection is founded on the idea of human smugglers as large-scale exploitative mafias that are just seeking to earn money from desperate people. We know that in reality, a lot of human smuggling still goes on a very small scale. It might be difficult to distinguish between migrants and smugglers if they all set off in the same boat, and that it just happens that one person is capable of navigating the boat. And also the distinction between human smuggling, providing the service of crossing borders, either to be an illegal resident or to seek asylum. That service is very different from trafficking in persons, which is something that is explicitly done for the purposes of exploitation. But by blurring the two and talking about mafias, human smugglers, traffickers as one big evil, that also sort of feeds into the narrative of protection, although actual research findings on human smuggling show that, yes, human smugglers can take advantage of migrants because they are in a vulnerable situation, but very often they just provide a professional service for a price. So these were the three narratives, and then we have these 8 different measures that we go through in some detail in the paper itself. Detecting migrants as they approach, for instance, through electronic surveillance systems along the coasts, and apprehending them so that everyone sort of enters the system of processing. Then post-arrival processing, which we know is a bottleneck in the Norwegian system, and even more so in many other European systems. Repatriation, sending people back if they are found not to fulfill criteria for staying. That has been a huge bottleneck in Southern Europe, and one of the areas in which European countries have really made an effort in recent years to sign repatriation agreements with more countries. Pre-border surveillance and control, that's especially what is being done at sea, coordinated by Frontex. trying to stop migrants before they even reach European shores. Then, number 5 there is something that we've looked into quite a bit, which is interesting, awareness campaigns in countries of origins, trying to explain people who might migrate that this is a bad idea. This is an example from Senegal, a popular magazine with a full-page ad placed by the Spanish government. Spain spent €1 million on this publicity campaign against undocumented migration. Then prevention of illegal employment in Europe. I mean, in Norway this is not the main issue, but in Southern Europe, for instance, we know that the big black economy is one of the driving forces behind continued undocumented immigration. And then number 7, making it more attractive to remain in the country of origin by creating employment. Or number 8, realizing that people will want to come to Europe, but providing alternative ways of coming through legal migration programs. So, yeah, all of these are discussed in more detail in the paper itself. The analytical point that I want to make is that there's a distinction here between different approaches to controlling migration. The first 3 are, in a sense, traditional, centered on control. Also centered on the border, making sure that people don't enter and remain if they're not qualified to do so or fulfill the criteria for doing so. Then this more recent trend of doing this even outside European territory is an extension of the same approach. The last 4 represent quite different approaches that are centered not so much on control, but on incentives and decision making, trying to influence the decisions people make when they set off in boats, for instance. I'm neither Maria nor I are political scientists, but I know this particular paper sounds very much sort of political sciencey and all these narratives and policy measures and mechanisms, and it seems a bit rigid, but we feel that we're sort of getting to some useful analytical substance by identifying these different things. So this is the 3rd level that I talked about. The narratives up there, the 8 policy measures, and then the 3 specific mechanisms through which these policy measures might work. Direct control basically means obstructing migrants from reaching, entering, or remaining in Europe. That's sort of effective exercise of migration policy at the individual level. Deterrence is a possible secondary effect. If direct control is effective, then other migrants might, or other prospective migrants might decide against migration when they observe that others are failing. So the idea is that by, for instance, apprehending migrants who arrive in small boats and sending them all back immediately if they don't qualify for protection in Europe, it solves the sort of potential problem of the people in that boat from the European perspective. It stops, say, those 50, 40 people from entering Europe, and it might deter others from trying because they observe that this is actually being controlled efficiently or effectively from the European side. So that's an indirect possible secondary effect. Then there is quite a different secondary or indirect effect, which is about making prospective migrants decide against migration in other ways than showing that we're controlling this effectively. So for instance, these publicity campaigns which just say that migration is dangerous and you don't have a future in Europe and so on, that's a form of dissuasion. Whereas stating an example by sort of showing that we are ruthless in sending people back and effectively do so, although there's large numbers involved, that would possibly have a deterrent mechanism. So how do these different things go together? And this table, of course, is also in the paper. I won't go into sort of the details of the overlaps here, but you can get the idea that with the 8 different measures, some of them are about direct control, applying migration policy at the individual level, stopping people from arriving and remaining in Europe if they are not fulfilling the criteria to do so. And if that's done effectively, it might have a deterrent effect. And then these dissuasive measures, such as creating employment in the countries of origin, or showing that there are alternatives in the form of legal migration programs, that has nothing to do with direct control or deterrence. It's about persuading people to do something other than approaching Europe in small boats. And then these 8 policy measures also speak to the different narratives in different ways. And what is striking here is how pre-border surveillance and control, that is sending European Navy ships, helicopters, airplanes out to African waters and detecting migrants who are there and picking them up and sending them back. That is something that sort of sits with the security narrative, with the cooperation narrative, and with the protection narrative. It's about the security narrative in the sense that we're tackling the problem at a safe distance. It's about cooperation because it necessarily involves cooperation with third countries, be it Libya or Senegal. And it's about protection in the sense that it's presented as keeping these poor people from dying at sea, which they would have done if we didn't stop them. And that is quite a dangerous development, we feel, because this shifting of migration control to outside European borders means that people are deprived of the rights they acquire on reaching the European border. They in general, have no possibility of seeking asylum when they're picked up in African or international waters. That depends on reaching European shores. Also, as I pointed to in the issue of concerns about how transit countries are implementing migration control, when more of the control is shifted to countries like Libya and Morocco, that can leave many migrants more vulnerable. Also, there are big jurisdictional and legal issues that are unresolved with respect to the status of people who are intercepted at sea. Commonly, it's, for instance, a European vessel, but with Moroccan or Senegalese personnel on board as well, and which country is assuming responsibility when these boats intervene and it happens in international waters and so on. That's connected with issues that are unresolved, and this lack of clarity with respect to legal rights is a problem for the migrants. And this also shows how the idea of protection is really a double-edged sword for migrants. It's explicit in a lot of the documents linked to external or external migration control. The European Border Agency Frontex, the Spanish system of vigilance and external vigilance, and the new Eurosur initiative, that what European countries are doing in international African waters is contributing to the reduction of human lives lost at sea. So we're assuming that these vessels are rescuing migrants in distress, preventing departures, and keeping migrants out of the hands of exploitative smugglers and employers. That's the sort of logic behind saying that this is a protective measure. What it, I think, to a large degree serves as is a rhetorical means to an end, in the sense that by presenting this as protective, it justifies measures that are very much control-oriented. And by doing that, it unlocks what's sometimes referred to as the liberal constraint, that there's a tension between the liberal ideas of European countries like Norway and the relatively restrictive migration policy that we seek to implement. So there's in general, in European societies, a misfit between the level of immigration that the population is happy to accept and the policy that's being implemented, and that's been explained by this paradox that in a way states are more liberal than they would like to be in the context of migration. So by saying that we're providing protection at the same time as we're effectively controlling, we're sort of resolving that issue. And this logic rests on some questionable assumptions about the alternatives. That is, what happens with these people who are intercepted and sent back? Do they just remain in Senegal forever after and give up migration? Probably not. They try again the next week or the next month. And that's also something that we found, that the being intercepted at sea is perceived as another obstacle on the way that might force you to try again. Deterrence enters the picture, as I said, in that effective control in the short term can contribute to solving the bigger issues in the long term if it shows that what European countries are saying about migration policy is also implemented on the ground. There's been a lot of skepticism in migration research about whether or not deterrence is effective, but I feel at least that there is a promise in the potential of deterrence to solve a specific problem in the short term and contribute to solving a bigger problem in the long term. What matters, however, in this context is the overall outcome of people's migration attempts, not just that they're apprehended there and then and sent back, but whether they give up on migration altogether. So, for instance, we know that in Southern Europe, detection and apprehension has been quite effective. Most migrants have been detected and apprehended and sent to reception centers and so on, but the processing of cases has lagged behind, and people have been released from the reception centers or detention centers, often with an expulsion order, but without a possibility to implement that. So what effective deterrence really relies on is policy being predictable, in the sense that people know that what European countries are saying about migration is actually going to happen, and also that this is effectively communicated. So, I mean, Maria and I have both seen in our fieldwork in Africa how a lot of Africans still have the idea that the first challenge is just getting to Europe, and then I can worry about the paperwork afterwards, and that of course goes very much against the approach taken by European policy formulation, but it's held true for a lot of people, and no wonder that that attitude is still widespread. So the predictability of what is going to happen if I try to do this thing that European governments say is illegal is an important element of it. And here there is quite also a big difference between the diversion in African waters, stopping people and sending them back, which to many is an inspiration to try again later, and repatriation from the Canary Island, which for many people have sort of shattered the dream of migration, in that they finally succeeded reaching Europe. They set foot on European soil, and their cases were processed, and they were sent back empty-handed. And they are much less likely to try again the next week. This actually ends the presentation, but I want to add a few more things, because I know the paper was originally written for an academic audience in a debate that was in a way, far removed from, for instance, the Norwegian policy debate. And some of the points made can be interpreted in ways that I wouldn't feel comfortable with in the context of Norwegian migration policy, for instance. First of all, it's important to point out that the starting point here is that migrants arrive across European external borders as a highly mixed flow. On the same boat, there are people who want to seek asylum and who have very good reasons for doing so and who might be granted protection, and people who might want to seek asylum but know that it's not a real need for them, and people who don't have that intention at all. They're all unauthorized in the sense that they're crossing European borders without an authorization, but the ones who intend to seek asylum with good grounds are, as we know, not doing anything illegal. It's part of the right to seek asylum to be able to cross the border to breaching immigration policy, but to exercise that right. So in dealing with these mixed flows, I feel it's absolutely essential to have the case-by-case processing as a decisive element. And we know that that's not been the case in Southern Europe, and we're also struggling with it in Norway, which is why I feel that the externalization is a problem, because it tries to solve the problem before, or solves the issue of migration before reaching case-by-case processing. But that sort of a heavy-handed approach on implementing those decisions might contribute to solving migration problems in the longer term, in the sense that actual flows might end up being more in line with the policy we have on who should be allowed to stay and who should not be allowed to stay. Okay, I think I'll end there.